Welcome, everyone. My name is Keith Martin Smith, and I am the author of When the Buddha Needs Therapy, which was released by Integral Life Press back in the fall. And today I really wanted to take more of a specific dive into a narrower focus of the book, which is to really get into this idea of what is awakening and how does shadow play into it. And most importantly, what can we understand, both as practitioners, but also as students, as we look to teachers and mentors in the field. So I'd like to start off just by really just sort of telling a simple story here. My teacher was Jumpo Kando Dennis Kelly Roshi. He was the 83rd patriarch of Rinzai Zen. And I'll get a little more into his journey and his understanding of shadow in a little bit. But when I would talk to him about the nature of awakening, the nature of enlightenment, he would often tell me that, look, when you awaken fully, when you have a complete enlightenment, it is absolute. It awakens all of your shadows, all of your personas, all parts of the personality, and that awakening, complete awakening, is complete. Nothing gets left behind. And I've come to a point where I really believe that that is just simply not true. And not only is it not true, I think it's destructive. I think it's destructive for teachers, and I think it's destructive for students. And I think it's, frankly, a bit of a toxic thorn in the side of Buddhism, Vajrayana Zen, but also in a lot of other kinds of spirituality, where we can see a lot of spiritual bypassing, which I'll get to in a minute. So my premise is that awakening can't awaken shadows. Hard stop. And in order to sort of get into this, let me just do a drive-by of what shadow is. And then we'll do a drive-by of what awakening is. And then I'll give you 5 things that I think we can do as practitioners, as teachers, as students, that can help to basically put an end to this reoccurring problem of spiritual scandal with spiritual teachers. And it's not just sex, right? We've had troubles with power, with privilege, with verbal or emotional abuse, money, money shadow, favoritism, nepotism, just all kinds of things that have come out, over the last 100 years, where we've seen lots of problems with spiritual teachers. So let's understand shadow. So we take a look at shadow. Shadow, very simply, sort of shadow 101, is the things that are in your consciousness that are invisible to your consciousness. A shadow doesn't mean like, I have a money shadow because I struggle with money. That's not really a shadow because I can see that I have a money shadow. So the fact that I can see it means that it's not really in shadow. Now, I might not have metabolized the shadow. It might still be really impacting my life. But the fact that I could tell you, I've got a little bit of a money shadow, means that it isn't really in shadow. So a real shadow is something that I can't see. It's part of the makeup of my egoic consciousness, of my small self, and I have no idea that it's a shadow. So there are 3 kinds of main shadows. And if you saw my conversation with Kim Barta a month ago, Kim really gets into this, and I'm really just going to recap what he told me. So the 3 kinds of shadows, you've got 3 kinds. You've got introjects. And so introjects are stories that seem like they come into your head that basically tell you that you're not a good person in some way. So an introject could be something like, you always screw things up, or, you're just not a good person, or it's just a matter of time until they leave you, or, I'm just a failure in my career. I'm just not doing enough. I just don't work hard. And introjects are stories that from the outside would appear to be pretty untrue. If you're like a really hardworking person and you have an introject that says that you don't work very hard, there's a problem there. So introjects tend to get put into us when we're little, like almost all trauma and shadow, but not all, but almost all. They get put into us by parents, by caregivers, by educational systems. And because they get put into us, and because they aren't who we really are, the therapeutic process around working on that shadow is to actually let go of the introject, to see that it isn't true. Okay. So in other words, I don't want to incorporate the introject. I don't want to get into a whole dialogue with it. The process is a cutting away and a letting go process. Second kind of shadow is splitting. So it's when the ego splits off. And this usually happens in relation to childhood trauma. And some of you may have heard of things like, your inner wounded child, or your inner child, your inner loving child, anything that's around an inner child. If we're doing any kind of parts work in psychotherapy, where we're working with selves, different parts of the egoic self, what we're working with is parts of our egoic consciousness that got split off due to trauma and walled off so that the psychological organism of me could continue to grow and develop in a reasonably healthy way. So if I have a not so good childhood, maybe my parents are not attuned to me, and maybe they're verbally abusive to me, and these sorts of things, then I might at some point take my inner Keith and sort of wall him off inside of myself and basically develop a persona on top of that helps to protect him. So maybe I'll become the rebel, right? Which is actually what I did do. Or maybe I'll become someone who's really obedient to authority, or, someone who's really aloof, or whatever. But the idea is that when there's a split off self and we go into adulthood, we're sort of a fractured whole because we're not in touch with parts of our whole self. Oh, and I should say too, the way to work with the split off selves is that's the work of integration. So if the work of introjects is to let go of the introject, then the work of the splitting self is to actually bring those selves together. We want to actually make the psyche whole by reparenting our inner child, by taking these cut off selves and bringing them into the whole. And then the third one is projections. So projections are really fascinating. Projections are everywhere around us. I mean, if you look at the current news cycle and you look at this sort of prototypical left and the prototypical right, what they are mostly doing is projecting onto each other. They're projecting onto this idea that the other side is wrong, the other side is evil, toxic, and the other side really needs to be obliterated or destroyed. They're just the worst thing possible. And so, projections are always when we have a part of ourself, part of our inner self that we are uncomfortable with and that we don't like, and that's in shadow. And then when we see that behavior mirrored out there, we become highly, highly reactive to it. And we want to basically destroy it out in the world. And we want to destroy it out in the world because we can't tolerate that it's inside of ourselves. And so, you can see this with a lot of the performative contradictions that abound on the left, where you'll see people that are, very caring liberals, and they're very concerned about equity and inclusion and fairness. And those are all wonderful things. We should all care about those things. But then they can be really intolerant and unfair and unjust and unequitable to people who don't share opinions just like their own. And that can lead to things like cancel culture and this kind of stuff, a real intolerance. So that's an example of a projection. So something that's intolerable within that you see out in the world and you can't stand it. And the way to tell if it's a projection or not, if you have a projection or not, is pretty simple. It's like, if you're like this, if you're really like, oh, I just hate that guy or I hate that thing, there's at least some projection going on. Okay. So introjects, splitting, projections. Those are the three types of shadows. So how do shadows get created? Well, there's really two ways. The first way is trauma, right? So trauma 101 is basically when you have an experience that happens to you, and the experience is so emotionally or physically intense that you can't metabolize it fully in the moment. And so the experience gets pushed off into shadow, where hopefully it can be fully experienced and integrated later on. That's basically it. So trauma is tricky because trauma is subjective, not objective. And by that, what I mean is that, you could take two children and one child lives through a war, like the Second World War, let's say. and grows up and actually doesn't have any trauma. And another child lives through the war and is highly traumatized by what happens. People can be traumatized. The spiritual teacher Reggie Ray told a really beautiful story once years ago about how in the depths of his meditative insight, he had this powerful memory come up of being a very, very, very little baby and being left in his crib for too long. And not like, not abandoned, like left there just a little bit too long. And the feeling in his little baby self of this terror of abandonment. And he tells this crazy story about, seeing this adult version of himself that was all dark, sort of blackened out, sort of walk up the stairs and walk into a room. And it was his seeing his literal shadow, sort of as a psychic projection. So trauma can happen through overt abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse that can cause severe trauma. But it can also happen with more minor things. If parents just sort of screw up in everyday ways, it can still lead to trauma that needs to be resolved in the adult. And then how do we know if we have trauma? Well, trauma that's unresolved tends to manifest in things like psychological disorders, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, other things that are not in the realm of, say, personality disorders, but are in the realm of psychologically distressing things that can get in the way of and interrupt life. Can interrupt your capacity to be in a relationship, your capacity to generate money, your capacity to feel fulfilled, your capacity to want to spend time by yourself, your capacity to be around people, to be in social situations. Sort of any time that we are feeling like I feel a really strong reactivity or anxiety or collapse around things, oftentimes that's pointing to unresolved trauma. So that's one of the ways that we can look for it. And in my experience, almost all of us are traumatized at least a little bit. And that doesn't mean we all have to be doing trauma work. But it means, I'm always wary of someone who says something like, I don't think I have any trauma. And to me, that's like, red flag, right? Like huge red flag.